the glass explodes inward like a frozen wave finally breaking, and in that fraction of a second, everything the Harrison family believed about safety, about walls, about the distance between the wild and the domestic, shatters along with it, because standing in the jagged opening where their sliding door used to be is a mountain lion, easily 140 pounds of coiled muscle and golden fur, and those eyes. Those pale reflective eyes that had been watching from the darkness just moments before, and the children are screaming, 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Lucas, their small bodies frozen on the living room carpet where they had been playing a board game just seconds ago, but between them and the predator now stepping cautiously over broken glass is Duke, the family's 4-year-old German Shepherd, and Duke is not backing down. His bark is explosive, guttural, a sound the family has never heard from him before, and his body is positioned low, ears flat, every muscle tensed as he faces down something that could kill him in seconds, and watching this unfold is their father, Ryan, who is already moving, grabbing both children by their arms and pulling them backward toward the hallway, and their mother, Jen, is fumbling with her phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands, and in this chaos, in this impossible moment, the question hangs in the air like smoke. How can a 70-pound dog hold off a mountain lion long enough for anyone to survive, and to understand how this family ended up here? We need to go back to earlier that same day, when everything still felt safe, when the glass was still intact, when the warnings were there but nobody wanted to see them. The Harrison home sits on a hillside in the Santa Cruz Mountains of California, one of those beautiful modern estates with floor-to-ceiling windows designed to blur the line between indoor living and the wild beauty outside, and Ryan had fallen in love with this property 3 years ago precisely because of that view, the way the oak trees rolled down the slope toward a creek bed, the way deer sometimes wandered through the backyard at dusk, the way it felt like living on the edge of something vast and untouched, and he had installed a top-of-the-line security system, motion sensors, cameras, smart locks, everything designed to keep out human threats, but he had never really considered what else might come out of those trees, and that morning, as the family ate breakfast together, Jen had mentioned something she'd seen on the local news, a segment about increased mountain lion sightings in the area, wildlife officials explaining that recent wildfires had displaced animals from their usual territories, pushing them closer to residential areas in search of food and shelter, and Ryan had nodded absently, said something about how mountain lions avoid people, how attacks are incredibly rare, how the news always exaggerates these things, and Jen had let it go because he was probably right, because they had lived here for 3 years without incident, because it was easier to believe in safety than to sit with fear. But Duke, the German Shepherd lying near the kitchen table, had lifted his head at the word lion, not because he understood language but because something in his instincts had already been activated, something ancient and watchful, and for the rest of that morning, Duke had been unusually alert, pacing near the glass doors, staring out at the tree line, refusing to settle into his usual lazy afternoon nap, and the children had laughed at him, Emma joking that Duke was waiting for his dear friends to show up, and Ryan had scratched the dog's ears and told him to relax, but Duke didn't relax, because Duke could sense what no security system could detect, something out there in the shadows, watching, waiting, calculating. By late afternoon, the winter sun had already begun its early descent, casting long shadows across the backyard, and the interior lights of the house were on, creating that familiar reflection effect on the glass doors, where you could see your own living room mirrored back at you but couldn't see clearly into the darkness beyond. And this is important, because what Ryan didn't realize is that from the outside looking in, those same lights illuminated the interior like a stage, every movement visible, every small figure on display, and crouched in the brush near the creek bed, approximately 80 yards from the house, was a young male mountain lion, maybe 2 years old, recently dispersed from his mother's territory, and struggling to establish his own range in a landscape fragmented by development and scarred by fire. And this lion was hungry, not starving, but lean, and he had been watching the house for nearly an hour, drawn initially by the movement inside, the small figures that triggered something deep in his predatory brain. And mountain lions are ambush predators, patient and calculating, they assess before they act, they look for vulnerability, for isolation, for opportunity, and this lion was seeing opportunity through that glass, not fully understanding the barrier but curious about what lay beyond it. And inside, Duke had begun pacing again, this time more urgently, his claws clicking against the hardwood floor in a rhythm that was starting to annoy Ryan, who was trying to answer work emails in the adjacent home office, and Jen called out asking if someone could let the dog out because maybe he needed to go to the bathroom. But when Ryan approached the glass door to slide it open, Duke blocked his path, not aggressively, but firmly, positioning his body between Ryan and the door and letting out a low growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, and Ryan paused, confused, because Duke had never acted like this before, and he looked out through the glass into the darkening yard but saw nothing, just shadows and trees and the faint outline of the wooden fence at the property's edge, and he told Duke to cut it out, to move. But the dog wouldn't move, and something about the intensity in Duke's eyes, made Ryan hesitate, made him decide not to open the door after all, and he would later understand that this small moment, this hesitation, may have changed everything. The children had moved their board game to the living room floor, right in front of the glass doors, because the lighting was better there and Emma wanted to be able to see the sunset while they played, and Jen was in the kitchen starting dinner, and Ryan had returned to his office but left the door open so he could hear the kids laughing, and Duke had positioned himself near the children, lying down but not relaxed, his head up, his eyes fixed on the glass, and outside, the mountain lion had moved closer, drawn by the movement of the small figures so near to what he didn't yet understand was a barrier, and his hunting instincts were fully engaged now, muscles tensed, pupils dilated, and he crept forward through the brush, using the fading light and the shadows to conceal his approach, and when he reached the edge of the concrete patio, maybe 15 feet from the glass, he paused, assessing. And it was at this moment that Emma happened to look up from the game board and see two glowing eyes reflected in the glass, and she thought at first it was Duke's reflection, but Duke was beside her, and her small voice said, "Daddy, there's something outside," but it came out quiet, uncertain, and Ryan didn't hear it over the sound of his typing, and then Duke rose to his feet, his growl deepening into something primal, and the lion, perhaps triggered by the dog's movement, perhaps testing the barrier, lunged forward and struck the glass with his front paws, and the impact was tremendous, a sound like a car crash, and the glass cracked but held, and the children screamed, and Ryan was out of his chair before he even fully registered what he'd heard, and the lion, now committed, backed up and struck again, and this time the glass gave way, exploding inward in a cascade of fragments, and the cold evening air rushed in along with the animal, and this is where we came in, this is the moment everything changed. The mountain lion stepped partially through the shattered door frame, glass crunching under his massive paws, and his eyes swept the room, taking in the screaming children, the panicked adults, and the dog that was now barking with explosive ferocity just feet away, and for a moment everything seemed to pause, predator and defender facing each other across a distance of maybe 8 feet, and then Duke charged, not recklessly, but with purpose, positioning himself directly between the lion and the children while snapping at the air, making himself as loud and intimidating as possible, and the lion swiped, a reflexive strike with claws that could disembowel a deer, and Duke managed to twist away, the claws catching only the edge of his shoulder instead of his throat, opening a gash that immediately began to bleed but didn't slow him down, and behind him, Ryan was grabbing the children, physically lifting Lucas with one arm while pulling Emma with the other, dragging them backward toward the hallway, and Jen was screaming into the phone, giving their address to the 911 operator, her voice high and breaking, and Duke continued his assault, barking, snapping, lunging forward and then dancing back, never trying to actually fight the lion because some part of his brain understood he couldn't win that fight, but buying time, creating chaos, making himself the focus of the predator's attention. And the mountain lion was growing frustrated. This wasn't how a hunt was supposed to go. Prey was supposed to flee, not fight back, and every second that passed was another second of noise, of resistance, of escalating risk, and Ryan, remembering the security panel in the hallway, slammed his hand against the panic button, and suddenly the house was filled with the piercing wail of the alarm system, a sound designed to disorient intruders, and the effect on the mountain lion was immediate, his ears flattened, his body tensed. This was too much stimulation, too much resistance, and Duke, perhaps sensing the shift in the predator's confidence, lunged one final time, snapping at the lion's face with enough conviction that the cat actually flinched backward, and then the lion was retreating, stepping back through the broken glass, backing into the darkness of the yard, not running, because mountain lions rarely run from anything, but withdrawing, reassessing, deciding that this hunt was not worth the cost, and within seconds he had melted back into the shadows, and the family was left standing in their ruined living room, glass everywhere, cold air pouring in, alarm still screaming, and Duke was panting heavily, blood dripping from his shoulder onto the hardwood floor, but he was still on his feet, still positioned between his family and the broken door, still watching, still guarding. The next hour was a blur of emergency responders, paramedics who checked the children for cuts from the flying glass and found only minor scratches, a wildlife officer who examined the scene and confirmed that the paw prints and the pattern of the attack were consistent with a young male mountain lion, probably one of several that had been displaced into residential areas by the recent fires, and a veterinarian who was called to treat Duke's shoulder wound, which required 12 stitches but had miraculously missed any major blood vessels or tendons. And as the house filled with official voices and radio chatter, Ryan found himself standing in the corner of the living room, staring at the boarded-up door frame, replaying every moment of the evening in his mind, and he kept coming back to Duke, to the way the dog had refused to relax all day, to the way he had blocked Ryan from opening the door earlier, to the way he had positioned himself in front of the children without a moment's hesitation when the glass shattered, and the wildlife officer, a woman named Martinez who had been handling cougar calls for 15 years, came to stand beside him, and she said something that Ryan would never forget. She said that mountain lions are ambush predators, they test for vulnerability before they commit to an attack, and when they encounter resistance, especially loud, aggressive resistance, they almost always back off, because in the wild, any injury can be fatal, and this lion had been looking for easy prey. And what it found instead was a dog that refused to be easy, that made itself big and loud and relentless, and if Duke hadn't been there, if he hadn't intervened in those first critical seconds, the lion's attention might have fixed on the smaller, more vulnerable targets, the children, and Ryan felt his knees go weak at those words, felt the full weight of what had almost happened settle into his chest like a stone, and he looked across the room to where Jen was sitting on the couch with both children pressed against her sides, and then he looked at Duke, who was lying on a blanket on the floor, his shoulder wrapped in white bandages, his eyes half closed with exhaustion but still, even now, watching the boarded-up door. Later that night, after the responders had left and the children had finally fallen into fitful sleep and the house had grown quiet except for the hum of the temporary heater they'd brought in to compensate for the missing door, Ryan found himself kneeling beside Duke's blanket, just looking at the dog who had changed everything. And he thought about all the times he had dismissed Duke's alerts as false alarms. All the times he had ignored the signs because he was so confident in his security system, in his understanding of risk, in his belief that danger was something that happened to other people, and he understood now how wrong he had been, how the greatest protection his family had wasn't the cameras or the sensors or the smart locks, it was this animal, this loyal, watchful, impossibly brave animal who had been trying to warn them all day. And when the moment came, Duke hadn't calculated the odds, hadn't weighed his own safety against the risk, he had simply put his body between his family and the thing that wanted to hurt them, and Ryan reached out and gently stroked the dog's head, careful not to disturb his bandaged shoulder, and he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "You stood your ground when I couldn't," and Duke's tail thumped weakly against the blanket, and he leaned his head into Ryan's hand, and they stayed like that for a long time, man and dog, in the quiet of a house that had been broken open and would never feel quite the same again. In the weeks that followed, the family made changes, reinforced glass, motion-activated lights, a new awareness of the wild that lived just beyond their property line, but the most significant change was invisible. It was in the way Ryan looked at Duke now, the way the whole family did, with a recognition of something that had always been there but they had never fully seen, because Duke hadn't become a hero that night. He had simply been revealed as one. He had always been watching, always been ready, always been willing to stand between them and whatever came out of the darkness, and maybe that's what loyalty really looks like, not grand gestures but quiet vigilance, not certainty but courage, the willingness to face something bigger than yourself simply because the ones you love are standing behind you. The mountain lion was never seen again on their property. Wildlife officers speculated that the encounter had taught it to avoid homes with dogs, which was a small comfort, but the memory of that night lingered, especially for Ryan, who sometimes still woke at 3 a.m. and walked through the house just to check, and whenever he passed the children's room, he would see Duke lying in the hallway outside their door, ears twitching at the slightest sound, always on guard, always watching, and Ryan would stand there in the darkness and feel something he couldn't quite name, gratitude maybe, or humility, or just the simple recognition that sometimes the ones who protect us don't wear uniforms or carry weapons, sometimes they have 4 legs and a tail that wags when they see us come home, and sometimes courage doesn't roar, sometimes it growls low and steady and refuses to step aside, even when everything logical says it should. Do you think your dog would stand their ground for you? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. And if this reminded you of how much our dogs really see and sense that we don't, share it with someone who believes dogs are more than just pets.